Have you ever heard of Foxconn City? In 1999, Apple was not the giant it is today. Contract manufacturing was taking over. Contract manufacturing is basically when you outsource production to third party suppliers. This was a cheaper and lower risk manufacturing method, but it led to IP theft and quality control issues. Quality control was a pivotal thing for Apple. Apple was a painful partner to work with. They didn't accept any defects, they had tough design requirements, while manufacturers wanted standardization. Steve Jobs was arrogant. He believed their products were better, and he was right. But that made Apple extremely difficult to deal with. Apple was only just clawing back from profitability at the time. Terry Gou, the founder of Foxconn, entered the picture. He saw something that the other manufacturers didn't. He saw an opportunity to learn from Apple at the cost of their own profits. Well, this was exactly what the Chinese government would eventually start pushing for, this high quality manufacturing and moving up the supply chain. Foxconn was building the manufacturing team of the future. It was operating like a venture capital firm for their own knowledge base. And at the time, no one was willing to work at the time, no manufacturer was willing to operate on this type of business model because it meant losing a lot of money in order just to learn. Once Foxconn learned how to build custom aluminium shells for the early iPods, the standard motherboard for Dell was not a problem for them. It was like they were training for the Olympics, then running in their local race. Foxconn operated like a military. The teams that were assigned to the Apple account received no compensation for the extra hard work, while Compaq at the time was Foxconn's largest supplier, and engineers who were working on that project basically received large bonuses each year. But for the engineers who were working on the Apple account, the reward was the learning experience and future job opportunities. To understand the culture at Apple at the time, we have to look how Apple treated its suppliers. They pushed suppliers to accept unreasonably low margins for the risks that they were taking, margins of only 2 or even 3%. That meant that if a supplier invested $100 million into a specialized factory machinery for Apple, they may only see $2 or $3 million of profits. This model entirely relied on volume. China was betting big on the success of Apple. And at the same time, Apple had a 50% rule, which meant that any factory that was growing quickly with Apple had to grow as quickly with other manufacturers. So it basically meant that Apple was giving rise to companies like Huawei and Xiaomi because the suppliers that were working with Apple had to also diversify out the different phone manufacturers. All of this knowledge was already starting to seep into the ecosystem. The difficult culture around Apple was no different for their own engineers. The culture demanded sacrifices on the personal lives of these engineers in order to create the perfect product. Chronic stress was so high that doctors were advising engineers to quit Apple. Cases of young engineers dying in their 40s, and Apple even had a system for this. They would give these $10,000 bonuses to the wives of engineers to excuse their husband's disappearance for month long trips to Asia. To understand what exactly Foxconn had to deal with, we have to look at the story of the Mac Mini in 2005. Steve Jobs wanted to continuously reduce the size of the computer. If an engineer said he could reduce it, Jobs would ask him to reduce it again, and again, and again, until the engineer said no, it's impossible. Then Steve would say, that is the exact size we want. For Jobs, difficulty was the metric of success, because if he could do it more difficult than any other competitor, he knew that this was a unique product. If no one else was willing to go as small as they were, they knew that they had something that no one else would have. So at the center of the connection between Foxconn and Apple was Tim Cook. Cook at the time was working at Compaq before he started working at Apple. Compaq being Foxconn's largest customer. What Foxconn was offering was to take all of the risk. They would produce the iMacs at $40 cheaper than any other competitor. They committed to global investments, factories in Shenzhen, the Czech Republic, and California. And for Apple, they get all of this investment for absolutely nothing. They paid $0. So when you look at the finances of Apple and wonder how a manufacturing company could operate so efficiently, Compare this to Xiaomi and Samsung. Now you know. Apple didn't own anything. They would pick up the finished products at the factory doors. The fragmented supply chain at the time was not helping Apple. Stories of prototypes traveling from China to Malaysia for specialized metal components, then back to China, and then to Taiwan for assembly. Finally, this was enough proof for Tim Cook's point to be proven that manufacturing had to be consolidated in one location, and that was China. In 2001, the manufacturing city of Shanghai was established. Apple's executives could go from injection molding to final assembly in minutes instead of the usual days or weeks that it took in the past. Then, in 2003, Foxconn auditioned for the jobs of the next generation iPod. They unveiled to Apple executives a fully reverse engineered operational copy of the third generation iPod. They did this in secret. They basically wanted to say, we've already mastered the process. Through Apple's training and our own engineering knowledge, we don't need the official specs to achieve this level of quality. For them, it was the perfect timing. Apple wasn't happy with their current iPod assembler, and Foxconn was ready to absorb the volume and demand of the iPod mini just as it was about to explode. All of this supported by the Chinese government. Foxconn had access to cheap land, favorable loans, and to cut through all of the red tape and have a factory up and running in 6 months. This was the new China playbook that gave Steve Jobs unconstrained design freedom. If he wanted to change a design in the morning, by the evening, he would have a solution in China. It was absolute control over every factor of production. This would reshape Steve's perception of what was possible. At the time, there was no going back. They already knew that this could lead to too much China exposure. The geopolitical risks were evident. They knew that they were building up the manufacturing base of China. But they couldn't change. They didn't want to give up design control, efficiency, and costs. So, for investors, what does this mean? This isn't a story about cheap labor. It's a story about who's willing to suffer first. China accepted low margins, extreme pressure for years of learning before profits. That suffering compounded into something that's difficult to replace today. Dense supply chains, fast iterations, and manufacturing systems trained under impossible standards. That was the standard that we're learning from Apple. When you see how Chinese companies are reacting today, how they move faster, scale harder, and tolerate more pressure than Western firms can, this is where it came from. Learning from Apple was one of the greatest things to come to China. So when we look at companies like Xiaomi and Huawei, we must also think about why is it that these manufacturing companies got so good. They were built off the ideals of Steve Jobs from Apple. All the learning that they took from Apple accumulated into the manufacturing that they do today. So if there's anything you take away from today's episode, I hope it's this. China didn't win manufacturing leadership only by being cheap. It won by accepting low margins, extreme pressure, and years of learning before profits, turning this suffering into a capability that they're exploiting today. Once the system exists, Apple couldn't leave without giving up complete design control, speed, and cost, the advantages that they have over all of their other competitors. And that's why we're not going to see Apple moving to India anytime soon, because that just seems like a complete impossibility when you're going up against China's manufacturing base today. Anyway, that's what I see from where I'm standing. Let me know what you see from your side.